is this guy? Don't know. Must have been to space. We've got some rather late additions to the episode here. As we sat down to record, we've had some great comments come through on Reddit that are well worth addressing. First of all, I was desperately trying to remember and failing to remember what the other robot that was originally involved in Heat E was. We've been reminded it was a robot called Clyde Built, which was built by the same people as Rusty. They basically brought two robots along. One of them didn't work, so they entered the other one. It was some kind of spinner built on a bit of a budget. From what I've seen of it, it looks like it would have been quite interesting, but we didn't get to see it, so who cares?
I mean, it looks like the picture in the Robot Wars Wikia site looks like a mini, less well-built tombstone. So it's that kind of shape.
Which is exactly why it would have been fun. The other comment makes a very good point about additional footage for the intro. Something that a lot of sort of casual viewers probably don't know is that the Roboteers tend to organise what's called whiteboard matches, which is basically robots that go out quite early. They've built the robot, they've made the trip, they want to have some fights. So behind the scenes in the pits, they will organise their own battles, and there will be footage from those that could potentially have been used as part of an intro. The only issue with that is that they're usually not the best battles for TV, because people tend not to put the big spinners and things into these whiteboard battles that you would want to see. It tends to be more like, you know, the behemoths of this world, the things that aren't going to smash the opponent up.
I wonder if this is what's responsible for some robots entering in the arena in their televised fight not working correctly anymore.
As far as I'm aware, people only enter these if they are already out.
Okay, fair enough.
It would be a very brave decision to have an extra fight for no reason when there's already a lack of repair time.
Life on the edge.
One of the ones that we did see, actually, was in the Battle of the Stars special, which we haven't spoken about because there's not really much there for us to talk about.
I've not watched it.
But in those, they did show a fight between TR2 and Behemoth, where Angela and Dara were doing the driving. So that would be a good example of a whiteboard match. That one may have actually been filmed before the series started, because I know that Battle of the Stars was filmed before the main filming started. But obviously, there's no real danger putting either of those in there with each other, because neither of them is going to do any real damage. TR2 was also a reserve anyway and never fought.
Yeah.
It would have been a good time for Behemoth to test out that grabber, though, instead of doing it in an actual competitive fight.
That would have been a good... But then it wouldn't be quite as recognisable, you know? Behemoth without its big scoop.
That is very true, and probably harder to drive as well.
Yeah, maybe.
Because you can't just push up against something and lift it, and they found it hard enough to drive as it was.
Yeah.
Wait, weird thing that you might not know about Behemoth. It has a reversing beep.
I think I did know that, yeah. That's a really weird thing to have in a robot.
There's some fantastic onboard footage from the live tour, and I think they might even have put the onboard camera on for a couple of fights at Robot Wars, which... First of all, is really weird to watch because the audio is just kind of the clattering and the electronic whir of the motors, which doesn't really match with the sound that's in my head when I watch Robot Wars. But then you've also got the bloody reversing beep going off as well every time they back it up.
That's amazing.
What I don't know is when they first put that in. I hope it was there from their very first appearance. Is it Series 1 or Series 2 they started?
I don't know. They've been around a long time.
They've been around forever and still haven't really got that far. But they've always been a good robot.
I feel like they've won... They must have won something, haven't they? A couple of times. I feel like I've seen battles where they're like defending some title or something. Maybe, or is that just some rubbish title that doesn't really count for anything?
They won... / were awarded and defended the challenge belt in the first series of Extreme, which was probably the most cringeworthy thing to ever happen in the history of Robot Wars. Whereas basically, you get the belt, if you win 3 times you keep it, if you lose, the people that beat you get it and they try and defend it. It was one of many sorry excuses. Well, not excuses, sorry and tenuous reasons just to have fights.
Well, it worked for me because I think that's probably exactly what I was thinking of when I was thinking they were definitely defending some title, so...
It was basically there for people that hadn't won anything. Tornado ended up coming in and getting it as well, so it was just kind of a bit dull from there.
Yeah, oh well.
If it had been kept between sort of mediocre robots, not that Behemoth necessarily fall under mediocre, maybe they're a little above that, but giving it to a robot that was already winning championships... that was a bit dull.
Yeah, we've got one other bit of follow-up from Reddit.
That wound was not going to stay closed for long, was it?
No, it wasn't. So we've been given a technical definition of an engineer on the subreddit, on the Robot Wars subreddit, which is a nice definition. It's basically saying that an engineer is someone with a qualification in engineering. So if you are like me and you have an engineering degree, then you are an engineer.
All right.
If you are like Ryan and don't, then you're not an engineer.
I'm also not a technician, so I'm not really anything.
No, so they were saying on the Reddit here that if you're doing the same thing as like an engineer would be doing, but you're not qualified, then you are a technician, not an engineer. I think that's a cool definition, and it also sort of highlights to me that Ryan and I have been discussing many things at once, all under the same guise of what is an engineer. And I think a technical definition is nice to have. I feel like a lot of our discussion ended up being about whether or not having that qualification reduces your creativity or your imagination. And I think we covered pretty well last time what we both think of that.
I'm not sure I was having that conversation. I think I got very lost in the conversation I was trying to have. You were having that conversation. I was having a third, peripherally related conversation of my own.
It's because we're really good at this.
I know, right? I mean, I was writing the show notes and I've rightly criticised pretty much everything that I personally said in that conversation because I did not do well.
And it's also, I just want to sort of take it back as well to where this all began, which is that at the beginning of this podcast, we were talking about Jellyfish, and Dave Lowry claims that not being an engineer, and I'm going to assume by that he means that he's not a qualified engineer in the way he doesn't have a degree in engineering or something, and he claimed that gave him an advantage, and that's the thing that has bothered me for this entire time and still does bother me, and that's what sparks all of these conversations. But yeah, technical definition of engineer, it's cool to have. I think it's nice to sort of know that it's nice to work with that.
Is it worth me taking a final second to clarify my position on all of this? Because I feel like I still haven't done a very good job of that.
If you think your third attempt at this will clarify it, go for it.
If I'd planned for it, it might be better, but I'll go for it anyway. I think I understand what Dave Lowry was getting at with that comment. I'm on the fence as to whether I agree with it. So I can completely understand why someone might be of the opinion that an engineer, as it were, and I'm doing air quotes as if that helps, an engineer is kind of this person that toes the line and follows the rules, and that not being that kind of person, not being bound by that education, could lead you to come up with something out of left field. And that's kind of what Dave Lowry had done with Jellyfish. You spoke about there being solved cases, or whatever the phrasing was.
Solved problems.
That's it. So this idea that there are stock, standard, accepted solutions for lots of problems. And if you know what they are, you're probably going to go with them and follow them and stick with them. Where someone who's coming at the problem a little fresh is like to have a slightly different view and might come up with an idea that is not only as good as the accepted solution, but better than it. So if you're someone who's going to be there going with the old way of doing things, you're not necessarily going to come up with something new. I don't necessarily believe that that is what happens in practice, but I think, especially sat there with the BBC looking for a soundbite out of you, I can understand why you'd say it and think it.
Yeah, I think suffice to say that a lot of what you just said angers me.
Oh, that's almost designed to. Nah, this isn't me trying to be contrary for the purpose of having an argument. That's my interpretation of what's gone on there as much as anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a slight misunderstanding of what engineering is about, if that's what someone thinks, but it is what it is. A good soundbite. It certainly served its purpose of being memorable to us. So
I'm not sure we'd have even carried on with this series if it weren't for that argument. I think that spurred us on.
Indeed. Shall we continue with our being spurred on and move on to what we're going to talk about with this episode?
Yes, because we're doing new things. New and scary things. So we've decided, seeing as there's a little bit of a gap until the new series of Robot Wars, we're going to take on the 2016 series of Battlebots.
And oh, how much fun it's going to be.
Oh, yes. I don't know how much crossover there is between a Robot Wars audience and a Battlebots audience. I feel like the crossover should be 100%.
Well, I feel like it would be much bigger if it was easy to watch in the UK, but it's not a straightforward thing to find.
It's not. Battlebots has been broadcast in the UK, but it was broadcast not even on Channel 5, on one of the weird way down the channel listings versions of Channel 5. And it wasn't advertised that much. So I feel like it's been underwatched in England. But if you are someone that likes Robot Wars and you haven't watched Battlebots, you need to go and do it, because it's basically more Robot Wars, and more Robot Wars is always good.
Yeah, it's well worth a watch. It's so very different to Robot Wars in the UK as well. Everything about it is different. The robots are amazingly different, like so much more different than you'd expect. If you've only ever seen Robot Wars, when you first watch Battlebots, your mind will be blown by the difference in the style of robot that they use over there. It's quite amazing. and just the general format of the tournament and the format of the TV show, it's very different. I think it's a lot more exciting. There's a lot about it that I really like, so it's definitely well worth a watch.
I wouldn't go as far as saying I think the things are shockingly different. What you've got in Battlebots is much more refined machines. You've got more money going into things, and you've also got people who've had the opportunity to compete off of TV for longer, and they've been able to compete with things like spinners that in the UK live scene we haven't been able to use.
Yeah, I guess what I mean by so different is that they're also a lot more varied. Like the differences between some of the robots in... If you think like the scope of robot designs that's used in the UK is one thing, and I feel like Battlebots just widens it quite a bit. You don't get anything like Red Devil, for example, in Robot Wars.
No, I am going to take a second to highlight how interesting it is that you are promoting diversity.
These are all diverse. They're diverse, but they're effective.
That's the thing. The biggest difference of all is that Battlebots is more competitive.
Yeah.
There are very few robots in Battlebots that haven't got a chance of winning a few fights. What you do have is a few kind of art bots that are there with a bit more of a focus on form rather than function, but the function is still typically there.
Yeah, and even in that case, there's only like 2 or 3 of them at most out of 48 robots, whereas I feel like the artsy robots in Robot Wars, when they exist, often seem to be more of them and stuff. I don't know.
Absolutely. If you're sat there now and you haven't watched Battlebots, I'm going to throw a couple of videos in the show notes that are from the previous series. There's no spoilers there or anything like that. I think they're going to give a really good overview of what Battlebots is.
Yeah, and you can find the show notes for this episode, by the way, at spinnerproof.com/episodes/7. That'll take you straight to a page full of links and notes about what we've been talking about today.
If you didn't look at show notes for last episode, you missed out because Jellyfish was there. And everyone needs to see that Jellyfish video. Anyway, back to useful discussion about the podcast. We're going to be approaching Battlebots in a slightly different way to Robot Wars, because Battlebots works a bit differently. They have a big tournament bracket, so instead of meeting some robots at the start of the episode and then seeing them all fight each other, it's kind of fights from all over the place, random robots in random episodes, and we just couldn't deal with that. So what we've done is we've taken the bracket, again, this will be in the show notes, we've split that into 4 quarters, and we're going to be talking about a group of robots every episode until we get through the whole thing. It's going to be brilliant. It's going to make sense when you look at my diagram, because my diagram's amazing. And my words aren't amazing.
Diagram's good, words bad.
Which is just the perfect way to podcast. If you're doing a podcast and everything needs a visual prompt, there's something wrong.
At least we're not talking about flags.
Niche. Very niche.
Should we dive right into our first group of 4 then?
Let's get into our first 4 robots, and we're starting with just the ideal robot to start with, really. We're starting with Tombstone.
I guess it's worth noting right now, spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. So, Tombstone. Easily
2015 series' most effective weapon. Just unlucky in the final not to win the whole thing.
Yeah.
This year, easily the tournament's most effective weapon again.
It's an amazing robot. It's what I love about this robot is that this thing is all function. Everything about it is for doing damage to other robots. There's nothing about this that's on it for show. I mean, there's one engraving of Tombstone on top of it, and that's it. Everything else is pure function, and I love it.
I'd go further than that. I'd say not only is it pure function, it is pure offense. There is not a single defensive addition to this robot.
So little defense on it.
There's titanium top and bottom just to stop the batteries falling out, and that's basically it.
He's got the option to use a lighter bar if he wants to add a bit more armour to it. In his fight against Beta, he did put a little bit more armour on the top of it. And I think he used a slightly lighter bar as a result. But yeah.
So if he's up against a hammer or something, he will thicken the top and bottom armour. But it's such a big weapon that nothing's really getting a hit in anyway.
Yeah.
So Tombstone, big spinner. Massive bar at the front, wheels at the back, nothing else.
Yeah. And you can see, I love as well, like watch it, you can see the way the wheels are mounted as well. They are shock mounted to the chassis, and you can see the huge bearings that the axle run through as well. It's just it's beautiful in the way that it's built.
It is absolutely gorgeous. There's a live event version of it called Last Rites, which is literally a very slightly scaled down Tombstone, and that is even less armoured. The only reason he's even bothered with titanium on the top and bottom is because there are saws to deal with on the arena floor. If they weren't there, he'd be running basically just thin plastic.
It's quite a beautiful thing, really.
Of course, as with any big spinner, all the damage that it deals out to opponents, it's kind of doing to itself as well. And Tombstone is a robot that really suffers from cumulative damage over the course of a tournament.
Yeah.
So there tends to be a bit of twisting and stretching and compressing of the framework the weapon is on, and that can cause some quite big issues behind the scenes.
Yeah, they had some issues in their first fight against Black Ice. They hit this fight isn't shown on the TV show, which is annoying, but you can find it on YouTube without any commentary, and you can see that Tombstone hits the arena wall a few times, which does a lot of damage to that bar, and then he can't use the bar again in the rest of the series. And I think the only other time that his weapon fails is when he's fighting Yeti in the semi-finals.
Yes, so in the previous series, there were quite a few weapon failures. So in a fight against Witch Doctor, the bar literally got broken in two.
Ooh.
Solid Hardox bar, I think it was, completely split in two. Luckily for him, that hit also put Witch Doctor on its back and ended the fight. There have been other times where, you know, if it comes up against a good wedge and it's getting flipped over a bit and hitting the ground, sometimes that will do the damage as well. That weapon, however, is so reliable that if it's going to break, it's very rarely the chain and it's very rarely the motor. It's usually to do with batteries burning out or something like that. He has been building spinners for so long that he has got that system perfected.
Yeah, he really does. And I'm stunned at how that chain does not break. It's amazing because it's an exposed chain on the front of it, but obviously nothing can get close enough to do any damage to it. even when Bombshell tries with its crazy adjustable height spinner thing, it can't do it. So it's amazing.
The thing with chains, I personally don't think that chains are that bad an idea. If you can get them tensioned correctly, they're a very reliable way of driving something.
Yeah, it's just having them exposed, man, because all it takes is one good axe hit and then you're done.
It would have to be a very good axe hit to get in between two layers of scaffolding.
Well, in the case of Tombstone, an axe hit is not the thing. I think if you're going to do anything, it's got to be some other spinner. I can imagine like Bombshell tried.
I can't look at any other opponents they've had that would actually have the ability to get in there.
I think Bombshell was the only one that stood a chance, really, and they failed miserably.
Good. It's nice to know that we still have robots we don't like, as much as they're all pretty good.
They're still there.
So from the excitement of Tombstone, we better move on to Black Ice.
Black Ice. I don't know what this weapon is. It just seems like two scoops that don't move. It's got
you
slots.
think there's only one weapon?
It's got like slots in the scoop that looks like it should do something, but I can't find any information about what this thing's meant to do. I mean, I watched the fight on YouTube between Black Ice and Tombstone, which is the only fight that Black Ice is in, by the way. I still don't know what it does.
Okay. Black Ice has 3 weapons. I'm using the term weapons loosely. The first are the things that you can see. On one of the scoops, it's got some tiny little sort of spinner cutter things that are apparently flywheel powered in some way. They don't seem to have any mass to them. They don't even seem to be particularly sharp. They're just there spinning around because active weapon rules. The second thing it has is a magnetic barrier that it can drop to get in the way of an opponent, because that's super effective. The third weapon, and I've saved this for last because it is worse than number 2.
What?
Is a harpoon.
What?
So this flywheel that I believe is possibly powering the spinners can also be used to chuck out a harpoon on a short length of cable. Point number 1, that's stupid. Point number 2, surely that is entanglement.
Clearly not. Oh, it's come out of yeah, wow.
I think it comes out of like the bottom of one of the scoops. As you say, it's really hard to find information on this. I mean, what? What?
I don't know, man. I don't get it. It's a lame robot, and its one fight with Tombstone was so boring. It wasn't even shown as a highlight. I don't think maybe it was highlighted in episode 1, but it was barely shown in the TV show. So
it did actually have another fight. It had a 3-way melee for a qualifier where it was up against Scorpios, who we're going to see later on, and a robot called Bad Kitty that didn't make it through. It won that melee because Scorpios literally got stuck under the screws, just terrible driving, and the other robot, Bad Kitty, the motors just burnt out of their own accord.
A win by default. Exactly.
It's just, I like the fact that, you know, they can say, oh, we've got a NASA astronaut. This guy's been to space. That's all really interesting, but it doesn't make for good fights. Although that said, I did very much enjoy watching Tombstone, not the big hits on it, because the big hits are quite normal. There's a moment where it's just grazing one side of it.
Oh, yeah. That's so
good. And
good.
You've got that beautiful noise, and you've got that really clear silver line where it's just scraping off that top layer of the metal. That's beautiful to watch.
That's a good shot. Go find that on YouTube. I'll Stick a link to that in the show notes.
I'm going to link every single fight that I can in the show notes. So if you're in England and you can't get access to these episodes, pretty much every fight is going to be there.
Cool. Should we move on to escape velocity?
I'm going to let you take the lead on this one because I know you're going to be excited for this.
Why do you... I don't know why you think I'm really so excited for it, because you mentioned this to me before I'd gone and rewatched all of this. You mentioned to me that I would have a lot to say about escape velocity. And then escape velocity comes on and it's introduced as this robot that's built by a SpaceX engineer. And then I was like, oh no, this is going to be a really, really rubbish robot built by an engineer and Ryan is going to lord it over my head. Escape velocity, while not the best robot, is not a terrible robot. So I don't really know what you're expecting me to say about it. It's a really interesting flipper design, I guess. It is a very clever solution to a problem that flippers have, but I don't know what else you expect me to say about it.
We're going to be talking about the flipper later on, so I kind of want to leave that for now.
Okay.
I thought you'd just be excited by the SpaceX thing. Maybe you're not as shallow as I think you are.
I mean, that is pretty cool. I mean, I'm a big fan of SpaceX, but I'm a fan of what SpaceX does, less of the people that do it.
But this is what they do as well now. They're moving into fighting robots, apparently.
They do. So a couple of people from at least one person from SpaceX went off and built this robot. It's styled a little bit like a lunar lander. I guess to say more about the robot. So it's one of these robots that's two robots. So they've got the main one with a weird flipping thing, which we'll come on to later, and they've also got a full body spinner mini bot thing. And they've got their weight distribution in a clever way. So if they're both in there, you need to take out both of them, I think, to win the fight.
Yeah, so this is theoretically a sort of proper cluster bot in that they're nearly 50-50, but not quite. It isn't a main robot and a mini bot like we see in a lot of other places. This is a sort of two-part team, as it were.
Yeah.
I would question the value of a half-weight full-body spinner. I'm not quite sure what they thought they were going to get out of that.
The guys that built this reckon it's a really effective robot. Obviously, I mean, they're going to be biased, but they reckon they've got a lot of energy in that thing still anyway, so...
They probably have a lot of energy, but it's half the energy they could have had if they just built a whole full-body spinner.
That's true. And then in their big fight later on against Tombstone, they didn't even use it. They took that weight allowance and they put it all into some extra armour. And the armour they used is really interesting, actually. They used an aluminium honeycomb for the armour, which is a honeycomb lattice made of aluminium to absorb energy. And it's what SpaceX use in the crush cores of the landing legs of their Falcon 9 rocket. So when the Falcon 9 comes back from space, they land it either on land or on a big barge. It's really cool. And the four legs that come out have crush cores in them so that it can absorb that last little bit of energy as it hits the floor or the surface of the boat. And they've taken that technology and they're using it as armour to try and absorb some of the energy from Tombstone's spinning bar. It's similar to the technique that Behemoth tried to use when they were fighting Carbide, but more clever with the fancy aluminium honeycomb.
It's a very good idea that I think was poorly executed, because they've used it as an outer layer of armour. So what they basically allowed to do is for Tombstone's bar to come in, dig into it, and tear it off. If they'd used it almost as sort of shock mounting behind another layer of armour, I could see it being a lot more effective. But in the end, it just made for really pretty shrapnel.
Yeah, I think because it's an optional thing for them, because it's like, well, we can do this or we can have our spinner robot. I think that's the compromise they've chosen to make. I agree. I think if they'd put everything into one design or the other, I think they could build a much better robot.
I will point out as well, the weight from the full-body spinner wasn't only invested in armour. They came into the competition a bit overweight and they had to remove a few components. One of those was the accumulator tank from their flipper, which is basically an extra tank that the gas flows into sort of early before it's needed, which means you haven't got to wait for the whole thing to refill between flips. You could, in theory, get 2 out quickly or 3 out quickly and not have to wait in between them. Obviously, you're going to have to recharge at some point, but it just gives you a bit more flexibility in the way you use it. It also tends to give you better power on the flips as well. So if you look at their first fight against Overdrive, that flipper is basically just lifting. It's pretty weedy. You watch them go for their little warm-up flip against Tombstone with that installed, they've got a lot more power in there. So that's another fairly big deal sort of improvement they've made between fights.
Yeah.
Shall we move on for Overdrive?
Overdrive. Vertical bar spinner.
This is Battlebots now. You can't be doing that kind of thing. This is very serious.
I was nostalgic, man.
Any jokes you do to introduce robots must now be in the form of rhyme.
Oh, no. I don't think anyone can do that any better.
Overdrive confuses me. It confuses me for 2 reasons. Number one, it is a so-called evolution of a robot from last year that had a lifter on it. And second of all, it's got a fairly heavy, seemingly very fast bar, but it doesn't gyro dance. And I want to know how they've done that.
Big squishy tyres.
Do you think that would actually be the difference? Because I don't really know. I always just assumed that if you want to stop gyro dancing, you just make things wide enough for that not to happen.
I think that's probably part of it, but I don't know. Actually, how they would completely stop it. I mean, there's no way they've completely dampened it, but I would imagine the big squishy tyres help.
If anyone out there knows why it doesn't gyro dance, I really want to know, because it's bothering me. Overdrive on the whole, though, quite a compact design. I just find it really dull.
Yeah, it's not a very exciting looking robot, really, is it?
We've got quite a few vertical spinners in Battlebots now. Last series, it might have been a bit more exciting, but because there's a few of them already around, it's kind of the least interesting of its kind.
Yeah, I don't really have a huge amount more to say about it. I mean, it lost so damn quickly. I haven't got a lot to go on. Yeah.
I think it says a lot that it was beaten by Escape Velocity, which, if we're being objective here, isn't a particularly good machine.
No.
The flipper was down on power at the time. The full body spinner has basically been taken out of the equation immediately because it fell over. They could have had a really easy route through, but their own weapon has broken down. It just hasn't offered much, in my opinion.
No.
With that in mind, should we move on to our next 4 robots?
Yeah, let's go for it.
First up, we have Brutus.
Brutus!
Now, we were just talking about vertical spinners having got a bit boring. They've tried to make it exciting.
Is this creative enough for you?
Me and my creativity. You like to talk about a standard drum spinner? This is a standard vertical spinner.
It's not far off it, really, is it?
This is basically last series' Witch Doctor. 2 big wheels on the back, 2 small wheels on the front, vertical spinner, no self-righting system.
But it's got guns. It's got gold guns, man. I mean, what more? What could be more American than that?
Sign number 1 that we're not doing Robot Wars. Guns!
Guns on the top. If it only had like an American flag across it as well, then it would be even more American.
Hey, wait for another episode. We've got that to come.
So it's an interesting robot with those guns, because projectile weaponry is not allowed in Battlebots or Robot Wars for that matter, and they've got these guns that do actually fire things, which is really interesting. So you see it in their first fight. They fight Mobius, and right after they suddenly start shooting these like fireballs out of the guns. They're firing these special effects bullets. I reckon they're just cotton wool covered in some kind of flammable liquid and then shot out, all for show. And it looks pretty spectacular. And it's especially spectacular because one of these fake bullet things actually sort of glances off Mobius just as Mobius is tearing itself apart. So it looks like they've actually shot it and destroyed it, but they haven't. Mobius would have done that anyway. But that was very funny, very entertaining, and the kind of thing you don't really see in Robot Wars.
I'd like to think I've made it clear that I don't like gimmicks, but I'm worried that I've come across as someone that likes gimmicks. So, for clarity, I don't like gimmicks. This is a stupid gimmick. That's all I can say. It's a stupid gimmick. It adds nothing. You're just trying to be different without actually doing any thinking. You're being different by strapping an amusing thing to your robot. This is the equivalent of, like, this is a really weird reference, but do you remember the old Robot Wars games?
Yeah. Or some of them.
There was
anyway.
a little attachment you could put on there that just went moo. This is the equivalent of the weird moo thing.
It's perfect. What more could you want in life?
What I'd like them to do is design a better disc. For the most part, they've been up against horizontal spinners, so they've gone out with the bar instead. But they have a disc that's really weird, because it's 50% well designed and 50% badly designed. They've done a really good job of making sure that all the mass is on the outside, but they haven't gone to the effort of making it single tooth. It's still 2 teeth, which means you're just getting half the engagement you could be getting.
Why is that then? Why do you reckon that 1 tooth is better than 2?
Right, so you've got a tooth that you want to grab hold of an opponent and either tear a hole in them or send them flying up.
Yeah.
The further they get onto that tooth, the more effective it's going to be. But you've got a thing that is spinning very, very fast. So there's only a tiny fraction of a second for that robot to move onto that tooth.
Okay.
So let's say, and this is obviously stupid numbers, let's say your disc is rotating once every second. If you've got 2 teeth, that means that your opponent has got half a second to get as far onto that tooth as possible. If you only have 1 tooth on there, they've got a whole second to get on there. They are literally going to get twice as far onto that tooth, and you are going to get twice as good a hold on them with that tooth. So this is something that we see a lot with people's drum designs. So back in Robot Wars, we spoke about Concussion doing a really good job with this. They had a very complicated design for their drum. It took a lot of machining, but it was effective. So if you've got something that's going to be working at a really high RPM range, which these small discs and drums are, that little detail can make a huge difference.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And what's going to happen now is 3 or 4 people are going to listen to this who've built robots with drums. They're going to say, nah, mate, it's not worth the effort. And if that is the case, I'm glad to hear it.
It's probably a lot harder to keep it balanced with only one tooth.
As far as I'm aware, this is something that some CAD programs do basically automatically. So in terms of, you know, making a shape and finding its center of rotation, that's not too hard.
Yeah.
The difficulty you might have is that as you use them, drums and discs pick up damage on the tooth. Or in the case of some others, if they're hitting hard enough, they pick up extra material on the tooth. So maybe there's an argument that you can end up out of balance because of that. Whereas, of course, if you've got 2 teeth, either the damage or the pickup evens out over the 2. So maybe that's one argument for it becoming unbalanced. But if you're going to the effort of making a robot that is good enough for Battlebots, I think you can go to the effort of doing that with your drum. Or your disc.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And you'd hope that over the course of 3 minutes, you're not going to get that out of balance with your weapon.
Oh, not at all. Not at all.
In Battlebots, you seem to have a lot more time to make repairs and swap things out, so...
I'm not sure that's true. Bear in mind, the 2015 series was literally recorded over a weekend.
Oh, so much better then, isn't it? It can be done, BBC. It is possible.
But then they are facing a maximum of, I think, 7 fights. So they have got maybe a couple less fights, a couple fewer fights. That's a half-finished thought on my part. We're probably going to follow up on that. I suppose we should now give a word to Mobius as well. We've kind of alluded to them.
Yeah, Mobius is a full-body spinner. It reminds me a lot of Typhoon.
Again, if we're going to talk about standard X design, this is kind of your standard full-body spinner in that it's got those sloped sides, and that's what we tend to see from most full-body spinners. There is, however, a detail to them that I find absolutely fascinating, and that is the way the teeth on their spinner are made. These teeth are essentially 3D printed. There is a process called direct metal laser sintering, which is basically the metal form of 3D printing. So instead of sort of heating up a plastic and then laying that down in layers, it applies layers of a powdered alloy, and then a laser heats those up and melts them into one sort of contiguous piece. I'm not sure if there are any advantages whatsoever to doing this. I feel like it's probably more expensive and more time consuming than just getting something milled, but damn it, it's cool.
You can get much more complicated shapes. SpaceX used this technology in fabricating some of their rocket engines. The Super Dracos are entirely 3D printed, so you can do some pretty crazy stuff with that technology. I agree, for this application, it's probably overkill, but it's pretty cool they've done it.
How big are the parts that SpaceX are making?
I don't know off the top of my head. Let me go and look it up.
Because what I'm thinking is, if you're going to machine something, obviously that's a subtractive process. So if you want something that is like the size of, say, a dining table, you'd be taking away far more material than you're leaving. And that's going to be a huge amount of material. So at that point, something like this might be more economical and more sensible. Whereas for something the size and shape of a little tooth for a spinner, you could be doing that out of a tiny little block of, say, titanium or whatever material you choose. There's not going to be that much wastage.
Yeah, it's quite efficient. It's they're not small, those engines, I'll tell you that. I think it's the entire sort of like combustion chamber type stuff that's 3D printed. I'm not sure all the mounting hardware in the image I've just sent you is 3D printed, but a lot of it is.
And that's a big enough piece that it probably makes sense to do it that way, or else you're going to be removing kilogram upon kilogram of whatever material you're using.
Well, they couldn't, they wouldn't be able to mill out a lot of this. A lot of the complicated stuff at the top would have to be cast in some way if they would do it another way. 3D printing, I think, makes a lot of sense. It's probably quicker and cheaper, and they can do much more complicated stuff with it.
I also imagine, because I know it is a particularly hard alloy that these are being made out of, I don't know if it's just too hard to mill effectively. That might be another reason for doing this.
Yeah, I mean, whatever material you're trying to mill, you've got to have a harder material for the drill bit on there, so... or the milling bit on there, I should say.
Diamonds! Actually, no, some of these alloys are even probably harder than diamonds.
Possibly, I'm not sure.
Of course, Mobius didn't make it very far. They basically destroyed themselves, didn't they?
Yeah, they spun up, but then immediately just started smoking, and they were really wobbly, and then they died, and that was it.
I do, however, want to take a quick jump back to Brutus, because Brutus did face off with Tombstone.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be a much better fight than I was expecting, mainly because they didn't bother with the stupid special effects stuff. But Tombstone went into that with their bar set very low down. Now, typically what we see when a horizontal goes up against a vertical is that the vertical can kind of uppercut on the weapon. But Tombstone set its bar so low that it was coming in right on the base of the weapon. So when there was a weapon-on-weapon contact, instead of sending Tombstone up into the air and sort of cartwheeling away, it literally just knocked it backwards a bit. They were able to get in, get at the wheels, get the wedge off, and absolutely destroy them.
And Ray is a very clever guy.
Ray is a master of his arts. Also, is it just me, or is he basically Pierce Hawthorne? There's a shot, either from this series or last, where he looks exactly like him, and it made me so happy.
That is a remarkable similarity, I have to say.
I'm going to find that still for the show notes, potentially.
Good luck with that.
Hey, I'm a very committed man. Next up, we've got Yeti.
Yeah, one of my favourite robots, Yeti.
I'm so glad to hear that, because let's just say I have a comparison written down. But we'll get to that. We'll let you stew on that for a minute.
Oh, man.
What a beautifully simple and effective machine Yeti is.
It's another all function, no form type robot, really. It's great.
Absolutely. The moment a robot comes in with that really sort of ugly setup of big front wheels, small back wheels, you know they are just trying to be effective. They don't care what they look like. No
cares about looks. Or, once again, he's sacrificed armour. He's like, there's no armour on this thing. He's put all of the weight he possibly can into that massive drum on the front of it.
You say that. It's an aluminium drum, which I thought was a weird choice. Because aluminum isn't a particularly dense metal. It's very soft, it's quite easily damaged.
Yeah.
I imagine it is easier to get made, but it did strike me as weird that they haven't invested much into armour, and yet they've still got that drum on. If you made that out of a nice tool steel or something, you're getting something much heavier, carrying a lot more energy. There must be a reason for that decision, but I don't know what it is.
I don't know, man. I mean, I guess the simplicity of making it and the cheapness of making it. Maybe these guys don't have a huge amount of money. I'm not sure.
I mean, they are making this up in Alaska as well, which genuinely might limit availability of materials. Maybe I'm giving Alaska too little credit for being part of civilization here, but, you know, it's kind of out of the way.
I've no idea. I mean, when they came on, they weren't expecting to do very well, so I don't know. I don't know why that is. It's still cool, though. I do love this robot.
And I should point out as well, Yeti was initially a reserve. I don't know what dropped out for it to get in, but they weren't even guaranteed a fight when they came.
Yeah, reserves in all the places.
Would you like to hear my comparison?
What is your comparison?
I genuinely believe that Yeti is the Jellyfish of Battlebots.
Oh, God damn it!
Let me explain.
How could you say that?
Right, Battlebots is a world of CAD and CNC and top-of-the-line materials and everything else. Pretty much the entirety of Yeti has been built by hand with hand tools and no attention to things like CAD. Now, I know what you're saying. I could call it the worm of Battlebots, which was also built similarly, but that would annoy you far less.
You're an arse.
Ooh, I think we should swear less this episode so I don't have to beep things.
I stand by my statement.
Next up, we have Lockjaw, the Deitor of Battlebots. Do you not like my comparisons?
It's going to take me a little while to get over that. Right, Lockjaw then.
It is genuinely the Deitor of Battlebots, because where else do you see a spring-powered flipper?
It's really bizarre, isn't it? A spring-powered flipper. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen that before. At least I've certainly never seen it recently. So really weird.
It is reasonably effective, to be fair to it. And I suppose it's a very lightweight way of having a flipping weapon. Because bear in mind, this weapon is kind of dual purpose. It's part flipper, part clamp.
Yeah.
So in that respect, I can see it being an easy way of getting that second function in.
Well, I would wonder if it was sort of originally designed as a bit of a clamp and then they thought, let's stick some springs in there so that it can flip things if we wanted to. I feel like it's clamp first, flipper second.
Which is very good, because in the Yeti fight, the flipper part immediately stopped working, and it was all clamp.
Yeah. Man, when they were fighting Yeti, the clamp jaw thing keep going over the drum on Yeti, and you could see at the end of it how much wear that did to Yeti's drum. It was crazy.
An issue of aluminium, really. Soft metal.
Well, seeing as you just mentioned that they built most of that by hand, then it makes a lot of sense that it's aluminium. Because can you imagine trying to shape tool steel into a reasonably well balanced drum with hand tools?
Well, what they've done, and I'm going to go ahead and say that they probably didn't do the drum by hand. That was probably at least on a lathe to shape it.
I would hope so.
They've got an aluminium drum with steel teeth. So the bit that really needs to be hard is hard. And I suppose the nice thing with that as well is that if they are getting damaged, you can just replace them quite easily, just screw a new one on.
Yeah, so Lockjaw actually lose to Yeti in the qualifying round. Yeti wins that fight. It's an interesting fight actually because Yeti seems to be really on top at the beginning, and then Lockjaw just manages to keep that drum not spinning very quickly, and Lockjaw has got a lot more push in its drive than Yeti does, and you can see that they start burning each other's motors out a little bit. I think Lockjaw loses its drive towards the end, and then the judges give it to Yeti there. But Lockjaw do get a wild card. They do get to come back in, and they fight Brutus a little bit later on.
I'm not sure how I feel about Lockjaw as a wild card.
Yeah.
Because the wild card system really is a way of making sure that either a robot that got unlucky in its fight goes through, or a robot that is just really cool goes through. And I don't really look at Lockjaw as being either of those things.
I feel like it's just a familiar name. Did it do well in the season prior to this or not? I can't remember now.
I couldn't say off the top of my head, but Donald Hudson has been around for a very long time in robot combat. He's a very experienced and also an extremely intense man. But yes, they definitely were in last series, because there was a bit of controversy over a handshake that was blown out of all proportion. So they've been around for a while.
Classic. Let's take a quick break from talking about robots.
And let's start talking about TV shows instead. I feel like we're still in our armchair production mode from the end of last episode.
Yeah, definitely.
But, we are English TV fans. Watching Battlebots kind of feels a bit weird at times for me. I don't know about you. Just with the Americanness of the whole thing.
It's a very different experience. I mean, if I could sort of talk quickly about what the sort of TV format of this is. So you've got a stage thing that's in front of the audience. You've got a presenter called Sam who introduces a bit of the show, and then she brings on the two commentators whose names escape me right now. Do you know them off the top of your head?
No, but one of the commentators constantly shouts the name of the other, and it's really annoying.
But they bring on the two commentators here who commentate all the fights and stuff, who I quite like. I think they're very good at what they do, actually.
I think having two commentators works much better than just having one Jonathan Pierce.
Yeah, because they play off each other, and it is very good. Reminds me a lot of the commentators in Dodgeball.
Yes. Great comparison.
And then you've also got Farouk, who does the sort of boxing wrestler style introductions to the audience when the robots are coming out. He does all kinds of horrendous puns and wordplay type things as he introduces them. It's a section of the show that I almost always skip because by this point both robots have already been sort of introduced enough to not have to worry about it anymore. And then you have the actual fight that they're going to do. And then you've got yet another presenter in the pit who goes and interviews one of the teams, often the winner, sometimes the loser of the fight. And there's just generally a lot more people involved, and it's much more sports broadcast than Robot Wars is.
And that fits really well with the slightly more serious nature of the competition as well.
Yeah.
People are in this more to win than they are in Robot Wars. In Robot Wars, you have a lot of people who are just happy to be there. Whereas in Battlebots, if you've got there, if nothing else, you've probably got some sponsors to keep happy. So you need to stay on TV as long as you can. There's only one thing that really annoys me about the setup of Battlebots. The sort of Americanness, as I call it, I can put up with. The thing I can't stand is the so-called tail of the tape before fights. Because what they do, in place of giving you actual information about maybe how these robots work or how they're put together, they give you arbitrary scores out of 100 in 4 categories.
Yes.
I can't remember what they are, but it's like attack, defense, control, and maybe something else.
Yeah, and it's presented, by the way, I'm going to quick real-time follow-up. It's Chris Rose and Kenny Florian who
Kenny,
do this,
that's the one.
Kenny, who do this quick bit of sort of commentary on the specs and the stats of the robots that are about to fight.
It's one of those sections of the show where there's a lot of talking, but nothing's really said.
Yeah.
It's very much hype build-up rather than anything informative. And I realise that not a lot of people are going to be as interested in the technical specifications as we are. So I can understand them not wanting to make that a big thing. But they don't even put this information on the website. If you go on the website to look at a competitor, you won't find out information about what their armour is or what they're using for drive. If they've got a spinner, I like to know things like the weight of it and the RPM range it's working in. You can, however, find out the builder's favourite tool.
You have favourite tool and also favourite robot. And an interesting fact, and that's it. Nothing else about the robot. Yeah, I mean, the one interesting thing that's on there, I guess, is they do have, like, history for the robots as well. So for each robot, they've got, like, a couple of tables about their history of fights, like total matches, wins, losses, knockouts, that kind of stuff. So it's got some useful information, but it's like sports information. It's not the kind of information that we want as podcasters and as fans of the show. It's not quite there.
It's the sort of thing that if you were doing like a fantasy Battlebots league, it'd be really useful to have.
It would. It's there's definitely more that they could do, because I feel like Robot Wars isn't very heavy on this either, but it does, at least on the title card things when the robots are introduced, it does have some stats, and Jonathan Pierce will often mention a key thing like the weight of the spinner or something like that. They do throw out some information without being overwhelming, so I think there's definitely more that Battlebots could do if they wanted to.
And I think there's more made available outside of the show as well. So if you go on the Robot Wars website, there are some specifications. Not always that detailed, not always that correct, but they're there and they're trying to give you that. And I think the teams as well are a bit more interested in communicating that information.
Yeah, I mean, even when you start looking around outside of the official channels like the Battlebots website and stuff, it's still so little information to be had. You'd think there's a whole Wikia thing. It's like a fan-run wiki for basically anything you can think of, but there's one for Battlebots, and you'd think of all the places this must have some of the key information about these robots, and it just doesn't. I think the most I could find was a weight given to a Tombstone's bar, which is something like 68 pounds, and I couldn't even be bothered to turn that into a sensible unit. So I don't know how heavy it is the short answer thing, but like, even, you know, but so few of these robots have any stats given at all, even on these community-run things. It's immensely frustrating.
I have found some stats on Facebook pages. That's the only place I've found anything. But another big difference between Robot Wars and Battlebots is that pretty much every robot in Battlebots has some kind of corporate sponsor.
Yeah.
So they'll have received parts or materials from certain companies for free or for reduced or whatever in return for a bit of advertising. That's one of the advantages of not being a BBC show.
Parts, unless you're Mobius, in which case you're sponsored by a costume shop. who surely give them money and then the ridiculous things they were wearing and not much else.
I was going through their Facebook page and there was literally an advert of the people that had given them the weird contact lenses.
Yeah, it really made me laugh when I saw that.
The only time you're going to find out, for example, what motor they're using is if it's sponsored. So if, for example, someone's using Lynch motors, then you're going to find out what it is. But if they're using it and they haven't got sponsored by Lynch, they're saying nothing.
I know, it's immensely frustrating.
So yes, we have some motors. They drive the wheels and the weapon. That's all we're telling you.
Secret motor.
There are a few motors and things that are so recognisable that it's quite common knowledge what they are. So if anyone's got an E-Tech in anything, you immediately know what that is. Usually because the casings break. And that's the most Robot Wars nerd thing I've said on this whole podcast.
So far.
Oh, yes, there's worse to come, I'm sure. Shall we move on to our third set of 4 robots?
Oh yes, we have more to talk about.
Oh yes, and there's some doozies in here. Kick us off, Sam.
First up, we have Ice Wave, and I've got written here they are a full-body spinner, in quotes, because it's sort of like a massive bar. It's a huge bar that's wider than the robot, and it's full-body spinner in the sense of their reach, but not much else.
I wouldn't call it a full-body spinner. They have a 360 degrees of attack, but any full-body spinner would have a rotating mass of more than 20 kilograms. Their bar is actually quite light. Especially for its size, it's quite lightweight. And that's what happens when you strap a great big petrol engine on the top of your robot. It's not the most efficient use of your weight.
That's what I was trying to figure out what the hell that was for so long. Petrol. That is something I really wanted to talk to you about as well. I was like, why don't we see any petrol-driven robots anymore? And we do.
Well, to say driven is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
It is only the weapon that's petrol.
That's so cool.
I'll tell you why. Have you ever turned a petrol engine upside down?
I have not, but I do know what happens when you do.
What happens, Sam?
They don't do very well. They stop.
They stop. Not the most useful property in robot combat.
I'll tell you why I know that. I think you'll
You're a
find
really
this funny.
bad driver, Sam.
No. I know that because that is one of the properties that is kept in the Robot Wars computer games, and that was one of the.
Absolutely right. Yes.
Yeah, so you had a choice of using like a 2-stroke or a 4-stroke petrol motor as the drive system in your robot when you were building these things in the game, and when you got flipped, you had a few seconds to self-right, or you stalled, and that was it. Which is the only reason I know that petrol engines don't work upside down.
See? Robot Wars is educational.
Actually, no, there is another reason, and that's because Spitfires in a steep dive would often stall as well. That's the other reason I know that.
To be fair, I think there are ways now of designing engines so that this doesn't happen, but probably not in the sizes and weights that you're using for a robot. Probably in the sizes and weights used in... Actually, I suppose we don't really use engines for planes anymore, do we? Not like that, at least.
No, not these ones.
But they exist. If you really want to turn a petrol engine upside down, you can do it. If you get the right one.
Yeah.
There are some good touches on this that I probably should praise. And the best of them is just plain sneaky, which is that they've painted the tips of the bar grey so that they kind of blend in with the floor a bit.
Yeah.
To make it difficult for opponents to work out where the danger starts.
That's a good idea.
That's a wonderful little bit of psychology. I do like that. Not sure that it's helped them at all, but I like the idea of it. That's the kind of little touch that I will always appreciate. If they could just, strap a massive motor in instead of a petrol engine, they'll have an even better robot on their hands.
Yeah. It's interesting there's a petrol one. That is, yeah.
There is one great effect of the petrol motor, though, and that is in the fight against Sub-Zero, you can pinpoint the moment that the weapon stopped working because the racket ended, and it makes you appreciate how quiet most robots actually are.
This is one of those fights that's it's not shown in full in the TV show, so I think I just saw a quick highlight reel. I've not gone to the time to find the full fights on YouTube, so I didn't notice that.
Word of advice: I wouldn't stress over it. It's not a very good fight.
No, I mean given that both of the fights that Icewave are in are just shown as highlights in the broadcast, suggests that it didn't do very well in either of them.
The fight against Nightmare is actually a really good fight. It's over quickly, but it's quite a good fight because you've got a big horizontal versus a big vertical. So Icewave has come in, it's knocked Nightmare's weapon out of whack, but Icewave has then broken down. So it's not a great fight, but there's a good big hit in it.
Fair enough. I might go find that later.
You could do, but first we should give a quick word to Sub-Zero. They haven't had the most stellar performance, but they're a reasonably interesting robot.
Yeah, they've got a very, very short throw flipper.
Yes, and again, flippers is something we're going to talk about later, so we won't say too much about it. But the way they've set it up with the big sort of scoop on the front, I do quite like.
I would like it if the welding was neater.
Oh, you and your welding.
Look at it, it's horrendous.
This brings me on to my next note. Sub-Zero was built on a ridiculously tight time frame, almost entirely by one person. So I think they've done a very good job to get it there. They turned up horribly overweight. They've had to shed quite a lot of that weight. Getting into the arena was a bit of an achievement for them. So I'm very sorry if they didn't grind down their welds nicely enough.
Well, they should try harder next time. Do you know what
Just plan ahead, jeez.
Do you know what the weight limit is on Battlebots?
It's something in pounds, and I only work in 21st century, so I don't know.
Yeah, okay. This is a problem we're going to have a lot, I think.
We're going to have some live follow-up to find out what it is. I want to say either 220 or 250 pounds.
Yeah, okay.
Which is slightly greater than Robot Wars, I want to say, but that's me basically talking out of my backside because I'm guessing.
So £220 is the best part of 100 kilograms.
Which is why I think 250 is probably the more reasonable amount.
Okay, so 250 in sensible units is 114 odd kilograms. My just as an amusing side here, my mum occasionally gives me temperatures in Fahrenheit, and the degree to which I don't understand Fahrenheit is ridiculous because she goes, "Oh, it's like 50 degrees." I'm like, "What even is that?"
Basically, 100 is too much and 50 is not enough for weather. That's my understanding of Fahrenheit.
Oh, anyway. Just a weird generational thing in the UK, that.
I'm trying to do some live follow-up here, but I'm not very efficient. Okay, a heavyweight is £220 or 100 kilograms. But that's only from the old series. Oh, hang on. Starting in Season 6, there are no longer separate weight classes. However, there is a £250 weight limit. So I'm going to say it's 250.
That makes sense. They can go up to about 113 kilograms then.
Meaning after all of that finding out, it turns out my guess was right.
Yes.
Go guessing.
Do you want to move on to Stinger?
Yes. I'm very interested to know what you think about Stinger.
It's this robot, yes.
Yes, it's the one that we're talking about.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that. The Killer Bee. I don't know, really. It's a bit of a weird robot. The fact that Megatento could take its wheels off with its pathetic excuse for a drum makes me concerned about how well built its wheels are, but I don't know. It's sort of like, it's a weird robot, and it's got the really weirdly placed flamethrower things as well, hasn't it? It's with coming out the top and stuff. It's a bit bizarre. Because
if there's any doubt that you've got an active weapon, just throw a flamethrower on so you're clearly doing something. That's the Battlebots way.
So has this got interchangeable weaponry as well? Because this can have like a big scoop on the front of it as well.
Stinger is a super modular build. What it's basically got is a rolling chassis and then a big sort of umbilical that you can plug different weapon tops into and then just mount them on that chassis.
Yeah.
So they've got the big sort of front shield, which is, to me, the quintessential anti-spinner approach. That's the kind of thing that Worm was trying to copy. Well, apparently not trying to copy, because apparently they hadn't seen BattleBots, but the sort of system they were going for in Robot Wars.
Yeah, this is that, with that configuration, it is Worm done properly.
Exactly, and that sort of has the two-way lifter where it can almost as a rear hinge lift up, but then kind of pitch forward as well. So it's got that kind of breakdancing thing going on. You'll see that a lot in the lighter weight classes as well, that sort of idea for spinner defense. They've also got some kind of lifting forks as well, but they're all about drive power and driving as a way to boss a fight. And I really like it because it is one of the very few robots that you could put up against a robot like Tombstone and think that has a seriously good chance of winning this.
Yeah, I think I'm just fairly neutral on it, really. I don't have strong feelings about it one way or the other. I think, like I said, it's a proper version of Worm. And it's got weird flamethrowers on it that I don't really get. But
flamethrowers as a whole thing, I'm just not sure about. But they do make for some decent slow motion shots.
Yeah. And it's quite good as well when it's fighting Megatento and Megatento comes over with its ridiculous ladybird obscuring thing, and then it just sets the flamethrowers off underneath it. That's quite a cool shot as well.
It's nice to know that something interesting happened with Megatento. We'll save that for another episode, because I need to have something to be angry about every week, or it's just not Spinnerproof if I'm not.
Well, with that in mind, do you want to move on to a robot that I might be angry about?
Really?
Nightmare.
Oh, I'm excited for this. I want to hear this.
What? Nightmare? What is this? It's got the most ridiculous vertical spinner I've ever seen.
Nightmare is a BattleBots classic, and without it, it would not be BattleBots. Nightmare is the robot that got rumbles, which are basically fights with loads of robots in at once, banned because it hit something so hard it nearly went through the ceiling. Nightmare is amazing.
Nightmare. The thing about Nightmare is I look at that and I can't believe they've got any control, because with that, so that spinning wheel thing must be nearly a meter tall.
If this show gave us any actual data on robots, then I'd know. Probably.
Well, I'm just looking. So it's got a picture. It's got a picture of the robot in front of the team, and it comes up to about their waisty type height, belly button if you're a bit shorter. So it's sort of it's ridiculous how tall that is, and so I just can't believe they can turn at all without that thing sending them flying.
Well, they kind of can't.
Yeah,
that's part of the fun of watching Nightmare.
Fun. It's ridiculous. So you can see that when it's fighting Beta, and should win really because Beta is refusing to sort of attack them. And
Beta's hammer has basically fallen off.
And then, Nightmare managed to take most of Beta's hammer off by the time Beta gets a bit more aggressive. But Beta still wins because all they do in the end is get under it and just kind of twist Nightmare around a bit. And then the gyro effect takes care of the rest. And Nightmare is left on its side, unable to self-right. I don't know, it's just...
I think your analysis of that fight is slightly broken, given that Nightmare's weapon had stopped working at that point. So gyro effect wasn't anything to do with it. Also, Nightmare, in theory...
It was spinning still. Like, it might not have been driving, but it was still spinning with enough speed to gyro around.
I'll go rewatch it, but I'm fairly sure I'm right. But you're probably equally sure that you're right.
I promise you it's still spinning.
Fair enough. Nightmare is, in theory, invertible. They've got a really neat, not quite self-righting system that they've added for this series. So you've got the disc, big and vertical in the middle, and you've got the 2 wheels on the little sticks either side. If it goes upside down, the whole sticks that the wheels are on can rotate about 90 degrees and just come out the other side of the robot. It's an amazing self-righting system. It looks completely ridiculous, but it does work. Unfortunately, for reasons I don't understand, it was broken against Beta. And you say on its side, you do realise it's triangular, right? On its side isn't a thing.
I think it was on its side. But yeah, I mean, I guess if they were going to move, it would have helped, but they didn't move, so it didn't.
The other thing to really praise them for is the design of the disc, because it used to be an actual disc, and they've gone to this kind of bow tie shape as a compromise between disc and bar. So it keeps most of the mass at the outside, but without carrying sort of unnecessary mass for where your teeth are. So it's slightly less susceptible to big hits from horizontals. Not that that helped against Sub-Zero. And it minimises the weight. You don't actually want to minimise weight, but it means they can keep a certain amount of weight for making sure that the drive is solid and the armour is solid. I think it's a very smartly designed machine. I think that is... Nightmare is the best Nightmare that Nightmare could be. I don't think you could make that specific ridiculous design much better.
No, but it is a ridiculous design.
Oh yeah, it's ridiculous, but spectacularly so.
Yes, it's not the robot that I'm going to get most angry about, but it is I don't know. I don't like it very much, but, you know,
I'm
to
just
each their
going to
own.
check this, but I am fairly certain that Nightmare has won tournaments. Just in case you start trying to tell me that it's not an effective robot. It's also taken some massive beatings, but that's all part of the fun.
It's just ridiculous, man. But whatever. It's very again, it's a very American thing. It's very Battlebots. You wouldn't see that in the UK.
300 mile per hour tip speed. Is that not doing it for you?
That's a lot of speed.
That's many speeds.
Many speeds.
I'm sorry, but my laptop is so bad that it actually takes time to scroll down to the bottom of this wiki page.
That makes me feel sick.
And it's not giving me the information I want. It's won about as many fights as it's lost. I'd say that's pretty good going.
Win percentage in season 2 was 33%, in season 1 was 0, and over the course of its career is 25%.
That's only including the 2 new series, though. I'm going back to the proper old school Battlebots.
You and your old school stuff, man. It's ridiculous.
Are you trying to claim that it doesn't count?
Is it still the same robot?
If you look at the design evolution, yes.
Okay.
The only difference is they've gone from a full disc to the bow tie shape.
Okay.
Nightmare's cool. Get over it.
Should we move on to a robot that we're both going to like?
Are we both going to like it?
Are you going to tell me that you don't like Beta?
Oh, it's Beta. I didn't realise it was Beta next. I hadn't scrolled down yet.
Oh, man. I'm going to be worried there. How could you not like Beta?
There is not a single thing that I could even imagine myself disliking about Beta. I'm sat here and I've just got a stupid grin on my face because I'm thinking about Beta.
This is John Reed's other robot. This is the equivalent of terahertz in the US, and it is amazing.
John Reed can do no wrong in my eyes. Apart from like Series 4 where he drove straight down the pit. But apart from that, he can do no wrong in my eyes. If we thought we'd seen good axes and good hammers before, and then Beta came along and just redefined what it means to be a good hammer.
It's I mean, it's a proper hammer as well. It's just a big, like, cylindrical with dome end thing. I think one end of it has got like a little spike thing just to really get a good solid impact, but it's proper just like blunt instrument for whacking things. It's very pure.
Do you know the best thing? That's the lightweight hammerhead. That's made of some high density plastic with some lead inserts down the side for a little extra mass, and then a tool steel tip on the ends just to make sure it's getting a good impact on things. There's a much heavier one, but it affects the drive too much when it's sort of hanging behind the robot, so they tend to run with the lighter one.
Yeah, it's a stupidly long arm on that. It's amazing. So completely upright, it's almost up to John's shoulder. It's ridiculous.
I see. There are also some really important details in this design that I want to run through. So first of all, at one point, Beta actually had electromagnets on the bottom to stop it jumping up when the hammer fires.
Amazing.
There was a problem with that. The hammer is so powerful, it was pulling the flooring up with it.
Oh, I've got to see that.
The hammer also used to be on a straight arm. The idea behind the sort of bend in it, because they can't stop it jumping, they just bent it down so that it still hits things while jumping. Pretty much all of the armour on it is kind of super shock mounted. So it's kind of mounted bottom end only on a bit of a hinge. And in the Tombstone fight in particular, you can see that working, that it is basically just moving out of the way of that big blade and deflecting it upwards. It is a thing of beauty.
It really is. It really and truly is.
The motor being used to power the hammer is essentially the same motor that most of the big spinners use. And I've alluded to this before, it's going to go in the show notes. The system of chains and linkages used to transfer the power of that motor into that big hammer hit is one of the most beautifully engineered and machined things you are ever going to see. It is absolutely marvelous. I'm not going to try and explain it because I can't. It's just brilliant and you need to look at it.
Yeah, and this is one of the few robots, I guess, that we see a little bit more of in the program as well, in the broadcast, because John Reed has like full 3D CAD blueprinty type things of the robot, and they use it in the TV show. You can see a lot of the design work that's gone into it, and it is, I mean, admittedly not clearly and only very briefly, but it is glorious, and we've got to take what we can get.
And he has a fantastic website that has all of this stuff on it. The final thing I love about it, he has fought it in England on the live circuit. And this was a slightly older version as well. There's a fantastic image that I'm going to try and find. On the live tour, it hit so hard, it went through the floor.
Oh my
Just
goodness
the power
me.
of this thing is absolutely ridiculous. And seeing a hammer actually get even remotely far in Battlebots is brilliant to watch. It's such a spinner-heavy environment that the fact that he's managed to take on Nightmare and win, and take on Tombstone and take it to a judge's decision, magnificent.
Yeah, so Beta gets all the way to the quarterfinals and only loses to Tombstone as a result of a judge's call. It's
a fair judge's decision. No complaints whatsoever.
Yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable judge's decision. Yeah, but it's an amazing progression, and it's just a glorious robot. We both like John Reed. We both like all the stuff he does. I love that it's still got the kind of aesthetic of terahertz as well, with the transparent polycarbonate combined with some kind of hardened steel around the skirt for it. I will also say that if you think terahertz jumps a lot when it fires its axe, you should see how high Beta gets when it fires its hammer. It's ludicrous.
Something else I should point out, it was meant to be in the previous series of Battlebots, but because of all the issues with the electromagnets and stuff, it had to withdraw. Back then, do you know who was on the team?
I do.
Dave Moulds.
Dave Moulds.
What a
yeah,
man.
that really surprised me when I saw that. Yeah.
Do we sound like really overly patriotic British people? Because that's something I've never been accused of before, but I feel like it might be coming now.
Look, it's just if people from the UK build glorious robots, then so be it.
That's not our fault, is it?
It's not our fault, no. It's not us being patriotic. It's just, we're being reasonable. This makes sense.
Conveniently, we get to move on to an entry from the colonies now as well. The Canadian robot Lucky.
Yes, Lucky. Not so lucky.
Again, it's another flipper that I don't want to talk about the flipper of because we're going to do that separately. But I really like the design of Lucky. It's like someone looked at Bronco, threw some frosted glass and went, yeah, I can make that, but I'm going to make it colourful. And that's all we have to say about Lucky.
It's a colourful robot. It's got an asymmetric, or at least in one of the fights, it had an asymmetric front. It only had a ramp on the left-hand side of the robot. It was really bizarre.
Yes, that was against Beta. I have a theory, but I don't know if this is correct. They'd added extra top armour to fight Beta, which means they've had to lose weight from somewhere. But they also have to have a wedge on because of the way their flipper is designed. The only way they can really be effective in flipping things is with a wedge on. So I reckon they've gone, well, we can't put the big one-piece wedge on. We can't put both two pieces of the two-piece wedge on. Let's just go with one and hope that's enough. That's the only reason I can think.
It was very, very strange to see. It looked really lopsided. It was bizarre.
To be fair, it looked even more lopsided after a few hits from Beta, so...
Yes, not good.
But yeah, I mean, Lucky is one that we're going to come back to later in this episode. Also, while it did lose to Beta, it got a wild card, so we're going to see it again as well.
Yeah, but not for very long.
Not for very long at all, no. Oh, I wonder where the next robot's from.
UK. It doesn't work as well, does it?
What is it they refer to it as on Battlebots? Carbide, this is. It's from the Midlands. Everyone else gets a town, they're just the Midlands.
It's because no one knows where anything is in the UK, and it's not Carbide, it's Cobalt. But I'll forgive you for making that mistake. As far as I'm aware, they're basically the same robot with a different different bar on them.
You would be almost entirely incorrect.
I think I saw possibly Dave talk on Reddit, maybe one of them anyway, talking on Reddit about that they are very different robots internally and stuff, but they're clearly the same pedigree. So what's different about them?
Carbide's better in basically every single component. That's the difference.
Any details, or is it just like Carbide's a better robot? I mean...
So for starters, what we have, and I suppose I am only talking about the new Carbide, when actually the first version would be more sort of contemporaneous with this. But we'll go with the new version. The new version, for example, has their custom motor, where they've taken an E-Tech and made their own casing for it, because E-Tech casings like to crack. They've also got, I believe, a much better drive in Carbide. Just basically lessons learned from Cobalt, really. The clutch system as well, completely redone for the new Carbide. All the small details that really make a robot work and make it championship worthy are better in Carbide. But the overall sort of floor plan, apart from some dimensions, basically the same. The principle is basically the same.
Yeah, I guess a key difference between Cobalt and Carbide for me in terms of what you can immediately see is that Cobalt uses an asymmetric bar. So it's got a bar that's, well, I would hope, still weighted correctly, but one side is like shorter than the other and a different shape to accommodate the difference in weight there.
If it wasn't weighted correctly, you would notice.
Yeah, you would.
That wouldn't be a mystery to anybody.
A perfectly weighted but still asymmetric bar.
And this is, again, exactly the same thing we talk about with Brutus and their disc, just scaled up to be longer. I would argue that being asymmetric is far less of a benefit to a bar, but they've gone for it anyway. It looks pretty cool. It makes it that little bit visually different. I think that's probably more the motivation than it being effective.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't really get to see much of it. It beats Overhaul in qualifying, but the fight isn't really shown very much on the broadcast. And then they lose to Bombshell.
This doesn't at all play into my hatred of Bombshell. There are plenty of other less partisan reasons.
So suffice to say, Bombshell is being a bit sketchy, but they have a horizontal spinner that can be at different heights, and Cobalt makes a tactical error in not attacking Bombshell straight on, and they come at it in reverse. Bombshell correctly aligns its spinner to take out the top of Cobalt's tires, and then Cobalt can't defend itself anymore. I would argue that this is Cobalt's loss more than Bombshell's win, but there you go.
What actually happened is that Cobalt made the very sensible tactical decision to not drive their weapon chain straight onto the blade of Bombshell and decided to go in with the rear wedge instead in the hope of either jamming it up or stopping it completely in order to be able to use their weapon without it immediately breaking. Bombshell then made the tactical adjustment to hit the tyres instead. Very different interpretations of the same events there.
Yeah, well, whatever. I mean, again, for me, the fight not shown in full again in the broadcast, so if you've watched the full fight, then you've probably got slightly more information than I do to go on there.
Moving on to Overhaul.
Our final robot for today.
Basically, they saw Bite Force last series and went, yeah, we could make that.
This falls into a category of robots for me, which is just cheap Razor knockoffs, really. They're just like Razor, but not nearly as good in that weapon design. It's the same kind of big arm thing that comes down. I mean, this is slightly different because they can lift things up again as well, but yeah.
I'd argue this isn't a crusher, this is a grappler.
Yeah, it's not quite a crusher, but it just looks like it, it's got that same kind of thing. But yeah.
I imagine they've gone for that design because they like the look of it rather than they think it's more effective.
Well, also probably weight. I mean, they've got I feel like they've got quite a lot of armour on there, so.
But surely not having that extra bit arching over and just having something, right angled instead would use less weight? Although I suppose strength of a curve, maybe. I can see that argument. The main thing I really dislike about them is that they had basically the same robot last time, but they've just painted it to look more like last year's champions. It's a really silly thing. But it annoys me.
The paint job is what wins it. Thankfully, we don't see very much of it.
No. Yeah, clearly it isn't the paint job that wins it.
So Cobalt do beat them in qualifying, but they get a wild card back, and then Beta beats them in the round of 32. With eventually gets a really good solid hit right on the back of the robot, and that's it. No more.
It is literally like punching someone in the back of the skull. That's what it looks like.
Yeah, and then this robot is dead.
And that is one of those victories for Beta that is purely percussive damage. They're not doing anything to the armour, they're just shaking things loose.
Yeah, I think they hit almost directly above the batteries as well.
Always helpful.
Well, I think that's it for our discussions of the first, 16 robots of the 48 we've got to get through.
It's been a wild ride already. I'm really glad that we've had the chance to talk about Beta in this first episode, because I don't think we're going to be as passionate about anything else. Maybe one for you. Actually, no, next episode, we've got Minotaur and Warhead coming, which I know that we're going to get excited about. But Beta is still, for me, the robot of the series. It's the robot that no one saw coming. And it really could have gone further. It's only made it to a quarterfinal, but that fight against Tombstone could have been very, very different. Two things have turned that fight. Number one, they've got a really solid hit that has only just missed the weapon motor on Tombstone, which would have been basically fight ending. And second of all, Tombstone have got flipped over, which has made it easier for them to hit the weapon mounting of Beta, which is basically the only thing that Tombstone was ever going to be able to break.
Yeah, when Tombstone's the right way up, it's bar, is it just the perfect height for Beta to just deflect with its armor and the way that's all built and stuff. But yeah, once Tombstone is the other way up, you're right, the bar ends up at almost exactly the same height as the weapon mounting, and it's so annoying. It's such a shame to see Beta just have its hammer removed from it.
But John Reed keeps driving at him just like he did in the Nightmare fight, keeps going for it, makes a judge decision of it, and I'll tell you what, I have never seen Ray Billings look more nervous after a fight.
Yeah.
He really thought he might have lost that. Realistically, from an objective point of view, you know he's got it because he's done more damage with his primary weapon.
Yeah, I mean, the way the judges work in this is they judge the way I would expect people to judge, which is all the points basically go towards damage done with the active weapon, and removing someone else's weapon does give them enough points.
I don't think that's the main difference. I'd argue the main difference is that they only class aggression as being things you do with your weapon. Damage is still weighted kind of the same, but Beta, once it's lost the weapon, cannot score any more aggression points, whatever it does.
Yeah.
It could keep driving straight at Tombstone for the whole final minute. You know, it could cherub the hell out of the fight, and it's still not going to get those aggression points.
Yeah. What do you think of the celebrity judge, by the way? This is another difference between Battlebots and Robot Wars, is you have two judges that are there all the time, and then one celebrity judge. I think for these, at least for the early fights, it's Adam Savage, and then there's an astronaut in some of them, and then there's Michael of Vsauce fame in some of them, and then
Is he? I did not spot that. I don't really watch the proper episodes though, so I can miss those sort of things easily.
I think he's in the last couple of episodes maybe, and there's one other person whose name I don't know. They didn't recognise them, so yeah, I don't know. What do you think of that though? Like variable judges there.
I think the way that they set up the judging is robust enough that you can deal with putting different people into that situation. In Robot Wars, the judging is so badly defined that if you had changes of personnel, I think that would be a big issue.
Yeah, it would make a big difference to the outcome of things.
And also, one individual judge is only ever going to sway a marginal decision anyway. So if something is quite clear, you can kind of rely on the two other professional judges, as it were, to get that right. The choices of judges is interesting because if you wanted someone from Mythbusters, you've got two guys that have actually competed. So to go for Adam Savage, maybe a slightly weird choice, but I imagine, trying to get hold of Jamie Hyneman and saying, hey, come on our TV show, probably not going to get very far.
Yeah, it's probably not Jamie's thing. And the other one was Grant, wasn't it, who competed? And he's, I don't know, maybe he hasn't quite got the fame thing, but then they got an astronaut that I can't imagine anyone. I mean, I can't name him, but I just recognise him as an astronaut. And Michael, who I can't imagine many, like the general public, knowing him. I don't know. It seems bizarre. So I don't know.
But out of BattleBots fans, there's probably a lot of crossover.
Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to know.
An astronaut's an easy one because that is instant gravitas. There are maybe double figures people in the world that have been astronauts. If you're not, sorry, in the world is wrong there. Out of Americans or North Americans in general, there are only double figures of those people. So to get one of those on your show is instantly a bit of a coup. Obviously, if you've got someone like a Chris Hadfield, you're then a level above in terms of properly famous astronauts who are also young enough to do this.
It's not as if these celebrities are particularly introduced or anything. It's just they're just sort of there.
Actually, sure. I think the only reason I knew that Adam Savage was on there was that I saw it on Tested. I think, unless you've got any objections, it's time to move on to our armchair engineering.
It's still here, yes. Let's do it.
I'm a bit nervous. I've not led an armchair engineering before, I don't think, have I? Or at least not very well.
I reckon you'll do fine.
With armchair engineering for this series in particular, I think we're looking a bit more at difference than anything else. There are sort of elements almost missing from Robot Wars that we get to see in BattleBots. We want to address them.
Yeah.
Today I want to talk about flippers, because in England we have a very standard style of flipper that we always see, which is basically a wedge and a flipping arm. Whereas in Battlebots, we don't see that, and we see more variety of flippers. So what I'm attempting to do today is sort of deconstruct how they work, because I think they're all slightly more ingenious and almost universally less effective than the English style. I think there's only one good flipper in Battlebots. But there's one important difference that I want to look at first, and that is the gas being used. Because for some reason, Battlebots does not allow competitors to use CO2.
Interesting. What do they use instead then?
They mostly use either nitrogen or just high-pressure compressed air. And the big difference between those is that CO2 you can store as a liquid, which means you can basically carry a lot of it. It's heavy, but you can carry quite a lot of it on board your robot if you want to, without it taking up too much physical space. You can get a lot of flips out of a bottle of CO2. Whereas with the nitrogen and the air, I'm not sure you can get as many. And this is one of those things where if there's anyone listening that has made flippers, I'd really like to know what specific differences the gas you use makes.
I'd feel like if you compress air to the point that it becomes liquid, I feel like that's probably better than trying to do the same thing with nitrogen. I feel like liquid nitrogen doesn't turn back to gas quite as easily, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think that they are compressing it to the point of being liquid anyway, because then you're involving a huge temperature change. I suppose pressure, temperature, they're different routes to getting to a liquid, aren't they? But anyway, that's more of a question to the audience than anything. I'd like to know some more about that. The interest here is the mechanisms. I've made some diagrams. I'm very proud of my diagrams. So again, if you're not a show notes person, you might find those useful to go and find, because I don't do words good, but I do diagrams good. So first of all, the typical British flipper. We've seen loads of these. Ridiculously simple system. You build a wedge. You put an arm on it with the hinge at the back. You have a nice big ram to push that bar up, and you have bungees to put it back down. Easy.
Yeah.
Big advantage of that is that you get a very long travel distance on the arm of your flipper, which means that it's quite easy to throw things because they're on there for a long time, they get accelerated for a while, and then they fly off. Broadly speaking, when we see flippers in Battlebots, they have a much smaller sort of stroke almost. So if you look at something like Bronco or Sub-Zero as we had today, the bar doesn't travel very far, but they still get quite an effective throw out of it.
Yeah, so I'd imagine that the shorter throw ones, because they're hinged in the same place, but it's a question of where the piston is placed, really. So in these short throw ones in America, the piston is much further forwards. I feel like these lifters can lift a lot more weight if you just put them under something and then pressurise it, just because of the way leverage works. They're going to be able to lift more weight, I would have thought, than the Apollos of the world. But they don't get as much reach. They don't lift it quite as high.
Yeah, because they're both technically a class 3 lever in that you've got the pivot, then the force you're applying, then the load that you're moving.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. They probably can lift more, although I'd argue that the pneumatics they're using are strong enough that they're going to be able to lift the maximum weight they're trying to lift anyway. The big disadvantage you get with these designs, the Americanized designs as it were, is that if you are low on power for some reason, whether that's that you've got a leak in the gas system or you are low on gas or whatever that might be, you're basically useless at that point, because all you can do is lift the side of something a little bit off the ground. Whereas with that sort of British or European design, even if you're low on pressure, even if you're low on gas, you can still lever something over because you've got that reach on the arm. And the other thing that you see a lot from these styles of flippers is that the ram is attached on both ends. So with the English style, the ram is pushing on the arm, but it's not attached to it. So that arm can theoretically fly a little bit further than the reach of the ram.
Yeah.
Whereas with Bronco in particular, every time that fires, it jumps a couple of foot up in the air because that arm is reaching its full extension, and then it can't go any further. So that momentum, that inertia, is pulling the whole robot up with it.
Yeah. By not attaching the piston to the arm that you're trying to throw, you get a much more gentle stop at the end of it. I mean, Eruption and Apollo still throw themselves a bit, but it's not nearly as much as Bronco does. Like Bronco, when it flips, is ridiculous how high it throws itself.
What we see from the British ones in particular is they tend to flip themselves over backwards a bit. And a lot of them, you'll see that the body is designed to almost encourage that. So on Apollo and Eruption, rather than being a sort of right-angled triangle wedge, there's a sort of cutout where that right angle would be that they can roll backwards onto a little. Yeah,
that's all stuff that just helps them soften slowing down that arm once they've set it up flying, trying to more gently absorb that energy again.
Which has to be kinder on the system as well.
You'd think so, but then, if you end up upside down every time you misfire, you use a lot more gas self-righting than other ones. Like Bronco when it misfires, that's one load of gas, whereas when Eruption misfires, it's got to do its lower pressure flip to get itself back the right way up again, which presumably uses more. So,
But then you look at Bronco, surely every time it fires that bar, whether there's something on it or not, that's quite harsh on the Rams.
I would think so, yeah.
Because not only are they having to deliver that push, they're then getting yanked apart almost by the momentum of that bar. So surely that's a lot of stress to put on those components. Although maybe they don't care about that. Maybe it's all about being effective for those 3 minutes and then replace everything if you have to. So with Bronco, although it's a weird system, it does at least work very well. And I do genuinely think that Bronco is the kind of robot that if you brought that into Robot Wars, there's a good chance it's going to win. I think Bronco could legitimately get an out of the arena anywhere in the Robot Wars arena. It's an exceptionally actualized robot. I'm not sure that the design of it is necessarily optimal. Escape Velocity and Lucky both have this kind of third approach that deals with that issue of the robot jumping, but I think does so at the expense of effectiveness to the point where it's almost pointless. Escape Velocity, I've looked at it, I still can't work out how it works. But it's got this kind of system where part of the linkage at the back goes down, and then the flipper at the front goes up. So the forces are kind of starting to balance so that it doesn't jump. Is that what you're getting from it?
So this is going to be really hard to explain. So go find a picture of Escape Velocity. But yeah, it hinges around a point that is about halfway down its bar. So and there's a piston that runs along the bottom of the robot underneath this sort of lifting bar thing. And then when it pushes out, so this piston will push out, which will twist the bar that's at the... So if we're looking at Escape Velocity from the side, you've got the front of the robot is a little wedgie type thing for getting under robots. It goes, and then it forms a triangle. So it goes up along the hypotenuse will be the top of the bar, and then it's got a short side down, straight back down, and then it's a right angled triangle at basically that point there. And it's got a piston that makes up that bottom section there. When that piston pushes, the short side of the triangle rotates roughly around its halfway point, which pulls down the back of the hypotenuse and pushes up the front. And the act of sort of having some mass going down while some goes up means that when they fire, I feel like their centre of mass must stay about where it is normally. So it doesn't really matter where the position of the flipper is. The centre of mass vertically is about the same, which means that there's not a huge amount of momentum going up or down when they flip. So if they misfire, they're not sending themselves flying, unlike Bronco or Eruption or Apollo and stuff that send themselves flying every time. It's a very clever, very engineering-y solution to this problem.
To be fair, it isn't a standard solution to the problem of a flipper, so I can't even complain about it.
No, this is exactly what engineers do.
I mean, you've explained it, I still don't get it. I would need to see a proper diagram of it, and I couldn't find a good enough image of the robot to see how that ram is working. I can see that it operates along the bottom of the robot, but I just don't understand what it's pushing against. What I'm getting from you is that it is kind of mounted into the front of the robot, and the extension is kind of backwards. The extension moves towards the back of the robot.
Exactly, yeah. So it's pushing towards the back, which is like I say, it's rotating the back of that triangle around.
But that seems like that limits the rotation of that sort of rear part of the linkage to only just over 90 degrees.
I think so. The arm itself is hollow on the bottom, and then the linkage at the back is just 2 bars up to either side of the arm.
So it runs through the middle of it, so it can rotate further. Okay.
Yeah, so it's got more than you'd initially think looking at it. But yeah, you're right, there's not a huge amount of information about this. The Facebook page is the best source I can find for these pictures. There's one shot from like the front at a slight angle which shows you where the piston is, and it's what I'm sort of basing a lot of my assumptions about how this works off of. And there's also a couple of shots of the chassis, but there's not a lot of information given about it. The team though did do like a Ask Me Anything on Reddit with some information about their full body spinner that goes with it, and they also explained why they did it this way, which is the lack of jumping around if they misfire and stuff. So there is some information, but not enough.
It's information, but not the specific information we wanted.
Exactly.
The last one I want to talk about is Lucky.
Yeah.
Because Lucky is probably just as weird, but I have at least managed to work out how it works. So what Lucky seems to have is basically a 4-bar lifter, but pneumatically activated. Now, we've seen quite a few 4-bar lifters in fighting robots in general. Storm 2 is probably the best modern example. Also, if you want to go into old school Battlebots, you've got Biohazard. And they're quite a good way of hiding your lifter bar within your robot until you fire it. So it kind of stows away nice and flat, but it's also able to get quite good reach to lift quite high. And it's also pushing forwards a little, so it gets a good kick to put things over.
Yeah, I think that's the key difference between this design and all others. All the other ones are just throwing the robot straight up for the most part, but this starts lifting up and then pushes forwards almost at a 45-degree angle. It's really good for throwing robots away from you. It's also probably quite good at throwing robots out of an arena if you're in like the UK arena where the sides are a lot easier to throw things out of.
Because if something wants to get an out of the arena with the sort of classic British design, it kind of needs to be driving forwards at the time. If anything, a flip from a British flipper is either straight up or slightly backwards. If it's got something right up its front and lifts it, it's more likely to throw it slightly backwards than forwards.
Yeah.
Because that's just the way the motion is going. So Lucky is quite smart in that respect. But they had a massive issue against Beta, where it looked as though the linkage was overextending and getting stuck. I'm tempted to try and explain this, but I really think the diagram is going to do a better job.
I think look at the diagram, but yeah, I mean, Beta hits. So once Lucky's lifting arm has been extended, Beta actually hits it at the top, which, like I said, it sort of overextends. If you imagine like your elbow bending a little bit too far, and then if you're putting pressure on your elbow and you do that, it takes quite a lot actually to pull it back. If you've got hyperextending elbows, most people don't. But it's
really helpful, Sam. Thanks for that.
It's that kind of thing. Well, I'm just trying to think. It's that kind of thing where it has a natural stopping point, and then it goes just a little bit too far, and then it can't easily get it's almost like a pop itself back into alignment to retract it again.
You almost need to re-extend it to pull it back.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of anything that most people would have come across that works like this, but nothing is immediately springing to mind.
That's why I did an amazing diagram.
Yeah, the diagrams are really good. You should definitely go look at them.
But to try and describe it anyway, the idea of a 4-bar lifter is that you've almost got a rectangle where the bottom is fixed and the top is kind of sliding around on those two arms, if that makes sense. So if you imagine getting like a rectangle of lolly sticks that are all attached together, hold the bottom one down, you can still move the top one in a kind of arc. Now imagine that you make the front one longer than the back one, and then it's going to be moving in an arc that kind of lifts. And the issue they've got is that the back arm, the short arm, is going too far and stopping it all from pulling back. That's the vague idea here. It's a really nice system. It's a really nice idea. But I don't think that doing it pneumatically is really a sensible idea, because a pneumatic ram is quite a harsh force being applied. Whereas usually when you use a 4-bar lifter, you're using either a linear actuator, you're using potentially hydraulics, although that seems a bit overkill, or you're using an electric motor. Doing it this way, they've just given themselves problems by putting too much force into it.
I don't think they've got too much force. I think every hyperextension was because something pushed it down into that state. I don't think they ever did that themselves.
I don't know, in the fight with Beta, I think after it happened once, it kept happening, which is how hyperextensions work in your body as well, to be fair. Once that sort of damage is done and it's found a way to go past that point, it will keep doing it. So it often ended up in this sort of slightly giraffe-like pose, where the flipper arm was almost straight up, with the little sort of downward bit, like a little head.
I don't think using electronics or some kind of linear actuator would have solved that problem, though. And I'm struggling to see the difference between a linear actuator and a pneumatic ram, to be honest.
They might be two words for the same thing, and I'm being thick.
I think they're functionally the same, and I think pneumatics is just a fairly easy way of doing it. And hydraulics would just be exactly the same, but slower.
Well, yeah, and it's the fact it's slower that I think makes it more reliable, because you have got much more control over where that extension ends.
Yeah, but that makes it much more of a lifter than
it's not a flipper at that point. Absolutely, that is then a lifter.
It's not throwing things in the same way anymore.
Which is why I would argue that a 4-bar system is more suited to a lifter. I think I've basically hit the end. I've really worked through all of my diagrams at this point. That's what it is. I have nothing more to add. I'd like to say that there's some kind of conclusion to be drawn from all of this. There's really not. I
don't know. I really like the variation, actually. This is something that I've really enjoyed when watching Battlebots again, is just the huge variation in the ways that they approach these problems. And I'd love to see designs like this in Robot Wars. I think this is exactly the kind of creativity and problem solving that you're looking for. And it exists in Battlebots.
That's fair. I think it also solves a problem in Robot Wars where a lot of flippers are getting rejected because they are all essentially the same design. So we've had TR2 and TR3. TR2 was originally a reserve, ended up making the grand final. TR3 was also entered and not chosen at some point, I think. And they're both excellent flippers, but they didn't get in because there's already so many. You've got Apollo there that you basically can't drop at this point because they won it. You've got Eruption, you basically can't drop because they came second in it. If there was a little more variety in there, we would see more of them. And I think it's really telling that in the previous series of Battlebots, the only flipper we really had, or the only one that made it any distance, was Bronco. Whereas this time we've got a couple more in there, and one of them also being vaguely effective. Emphasis on the vaguely.
I think we're done. You can find the show notes for this episode at spinnerproof.com/episodes/7, and there you'll find the links to everything we've talked about today. You'll also find links to our iTunes page. We'd really appreciate a rating over there. It really helps us out to introduce the show to new listeners and stuff. And you can also find us on Twitter at Spinnerproof, and you can tweet us your questions, your feedback, anything really. We love reading it.
What he said.
Bye!
Now I get to talk about Sam while he's not there. How the tables have turned. Unfortunately, I've got nothing to say about him, so it's all kind of wasted. But just know that next time this happens, I'm going to plan for it. I'm going to be ready. And there's going to be so much said. It'll be scathing.